Hook. She was 23 years old, newly widowed, and standing on a hillside nobody wanted. Behind her, a family celebrated. Not openly, they had enough manners for that. But she heard the laughter drifting from the tall windows of Blackthorn House, and she understood exactly what it meant. They had given her this slope of broken rock and frozen mud because they expected her to disappear from it, quietly, before spring. Here is what they did not account for. Alara Dunn had never done anything quietly in her life. What happens when a woman the world has discarded decides to build something the world cannot destroy? Stay with this story until the very end, because the answer will change how you think about strength itself. Hit that like button, follow along, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. Now let's go back to the beginning. October 1887, the borderlands north of Inverness. The frost came early that year. It arrived not as a gradual cooling, but as something decisive. Overnight, the ground along the upper hillsides turned the colour of pewter, and the grass that had bent soft and green all summer snapped underfoot like dried kindling. The farmers in the valley of Dunrath noticed it before dawn on the 14th of October, when they stepped outside to check their animals and found their breath hanging white in the air, a full 3 weeks earlier than any of them could remember. Old Fergus Macready, who kept a weather log in a leather journal he'd carried for 31 years, stood at his fence line that morning and stared north toward the ridgeline above town. He wrote 3 words in his journal that day, then underlined them twice. Earlier than expected. He didn't write what that meant for the season ahead. He didn't need to. The valley of Dunrath sat in a geographical peculiarity that locals had grown up understanding the way children understand danger, not through explanation, but through accumulated incident. 3 ridgelines met above the town in a shape that funneled wind down from the northwest in winter with a force that seemed disproportionate to the geography. Storms that struck the coast 80 miles away as moderate inconveniences arrived in Dunrath transformed into something more serious. Roofs peeled, walls cracked along their northern faces. Every decade or so, a chimney came down. And once, in 1863, an entire barn belonging to the Oldwith family had simply ceased to exist between midnight and morning during a particularly determined February gale. The family had found pieces of it in 4 different fields the following week. People in Dunrath built accordingly, or they tried to. The problem, the persistent, generational, maddening problem, was that building well in Dunrath required money, and money in Dunrath flowed reliably in one direction, toward the Blackthorns. The Blackthorns had owned the valley, and most of the hillsides around it, for 3 generations. Edmund Blackthorn, the current patriarch, was 61 years old, broad across the shoulders, and possessed of the particular confidence that accumulates in men who have inherited enough land to never truly feel uncertain about anything. He was not cruel, exactly. He was something more difficult to argue against. He was certain. Certain about crop rotations, about tenant agreements, about which families in the valley were industrious and which were merely waiting for someone else's effort to carry them. He had opinions about timber and stone and the correct way to build a wall, and he shared these opinions freely because in his experience, his opinions had generally proven correct, and no one in the valley was positioned to demonstrate otherwise. His house sat on the best sheltered section of the eastern slope, a location chosen by his grandfather with obvious care. The Blackthorn mansion was built from imported timber, wide planked and expensive, with large windows facing south to catch winter light, and a stone foundation that Edmund's grandfather had paid professional masons from Edinburgh to lay. It was, by the standards of Dunrath, an impressive structure. 4 chimneys, 8 bedrooms, a parlour with actual glass windows on 3 walls. Edmund Blackthorn looked at his house and saw evidence of good judgment. The valley agreed with him. That was simply how things were. It was into this particular ecosystem of certainty that Alara Dunn had married 2 years prior, when she wed Thomas Dunn, a young man who leased 40 acres of Blackthorn land on the lower valley floor. Thomas was good-natured and worked hard and died of a chest infection in late September at the age of 26, leaving Alara with a leased farmhouse, a small debt against the lease, and no legal claim to either the land or the tenancy, both of which reverted to the Blackthorn estate upon a tenant's death without male heir. She had known this was the arrangement when she married. Everyone in Dunrath leased on these terms. It hadn't seemed worth dwelling on during the 2 years of her marriage because Thomas was young and healthy, and the idea of him simply stopping the way a clock stops had not felt like something that required practical preparation. Now it did. Edmund Blackthorne gave her 2 weeks to vacate the farmhouse. He delivered this news himself, in person, which he considered a gesture of respect. He brought his eldest son, Callum, who was 32 and managed most of the estate's day-to-day decisions, and they sat in the kitchen of the farmhouse where Alara had lived for 2 years. And Edmund explained the legal situation with the careful patience of a man explaining something to someone he expects to struggle with it. The tenancy can't transfer, he said. It's in the original agreement, you understand. Alara understood. There's a question of the debt against the lease, Callum added. He had his father's certainty without yet having developed his father's occasional capacity for tact. 7 months outstanding. That'll need settling. I don't have 7 months of lease payment, Alara said. No. Callum glanced at his father. We're prepared to forgive the debt in exchange for a clean departure, which we think is fair. Fair, she said. Not a question, not agreement, just the word, sitting there. Edmund Blackthorne was not an unkind man. He cleared his throat. There's the matter of where you'll go. Have you family? Her grandmother had died the previous winter. Her parents had passed before her marriage. Her father from a fall. Her mother from the same chest infection that would eventually take Thomas, though it had taken her mother more slowly and with considerably more suffering. She had a cousin somewhere south of Aberdeen, who she had not seen in 4 years and who had 5 children and a small croft already crowded past its practical limits. I'll manage, she said. There's the North Slope, Callum said, and even he had the decency to hesitate slightly before continuing. The far parcel. Above the ridge, we can't farm it. Wrong pitch, wrong soil, rock outcroppings, but it's Blackthorne land and it's available. You could have use of it. Informal arrangement, a place to settle yourself if you needed a temporary. For how long? She said. Callum and his father exchanged a look that Alara was not meant to see, but did. We'd revisit in spring, Edmund said, which answered her question completely without answering it at all. She asked to see it. They sent a farmhand named Donald to take her up the following morning. Donald was 17 and embarrassed by the assignment, and didn't speak during the 40-minute walk up the slope except to point twice at landmarks she should use to find her way back. When they reached the north parcel, he stopped at the boundary marker, a mossy stone post, and gestured vaguely at the terrain beyond it. Alara stood at the edge of the parcel and looked at it. It was, objectively, not promising. The slope ran at a steep angle, northeast facing, which meant it caught wind and shed heat. The soil, where there was soil, was shallow and rocky and already hardening into something close to concrete in the early October cold. Large outcroppings of grey granite pushed through the hillside at irregular intervals like the knuckles of a fist clenched just beneath the surface. There was no existing structure, not even a collapsed one. There was a spring somewhere above. She could hear water moving in the rock, which meant either a blessing or a flooding risk, depending on how it was managed. There were 3 trees, all of them leaning at the same angle, which told her something about wind direction that she filed away without thinking much about it. Donald watched her walk the parcel in a pattern that didn't make immediate sense to him. She wasn't walking the perimeter. She wasn't looking for level ground. She kept stopping and doing nothing visible, just standing, facing a direction, then shifting her weight and facing another direction. It's rough land, he offered, because the silence was making him uncomfortable. Nobody's built up here, not since... I don't think anyone's built up here, actually. She crouched down near one of the rock outcroppings and pressed her palm flat against the granite. Left it there for a moment. Donald had absolutely no explanation for this. Cold side of the hill, he said. The rock holds heat, she said without looking up. Once it gets any. He didn't know what to do with that. She stood and looked northeast, toward the direction the winter wind would come from. And then she looked at the 3 leaning trees again. And then she looked down the slope at the angles and how they met. And Donald had the distinct and unsettling impression that she was seeing something he wasn't. She told him she'd take it. He walked back down to the Blackthorne estate and reported this to Callum, who reported it to his father, who shook his head slowly, in the way a man shakes his head when the world confirms what he already suspected about it. Leave her to it, Edmund said. She'll come down when she's ready. Alara Dunn had grown up 200 miles south of Dunrath, in a village near the coast of Argyllshire that exists now only as a name on old maps. Her grandmother, Moira, had been the most interesting person she'd ever known, and remained so even years after Moira's death. Moira had never owned land. She had never owned much of anything. But she had built things. Not large things. A pig shelter that outlasted every other building on the lane by 2 decades. A smokehouse with walls so well pointed that it stayed airtight through 40 years of Atlantic weather. A garden wall that people in the village still argued about because they could not agree on how it had been built. It looked, as more than one person put it, like it had grown from the ground rather than being placed on it. Moira had learned from her own grandmother, who had learned from someone else, a chain of knowledge passing backward into a time before anyone thought to write such things down. It was not formal knowledge, it had no name. It was closer to a set of questions you learn to ask. Where does the water go? Where does the wind come from? And where does it go when it gets here? Where is the ground warm, and where is it cold, and why? How do things last? Alara had followed her grandmother around building sites from the age of 4, asking questions and sometimes receiving answers and sometimes receiving silence that was its own kind of answer. By the time she was 12, she could look at a finished wall and tell you, with reasonable accuracy, how long it would stand and where it would fail first. By 15, she could build a dry stone wall that wouldn't move. By 18, she had largely stopped thinking about any of this, because the knowledge had passed beyond the stage of conscious effort and had simply become the way she perceived physical space. She had never considered it useful particularly. It was grandmother knowledge. It was the kind of thing that existed alongside knowing which plants eased a cough and how to read clouds for weather, practical and quiet, and not something you mentioned to people who had not asked. Standing on the north parcel above Dunrath in October of 1887, Alara found it suddenly very useful indeed. She went back down the hill twice before she started building. The first time was to collect her belongings from the farmhouse, everything that would fit in 2 large sacks, which was most of what she owned. She carried them up in one trip, breathing hard by the top, but not stopping. She set them under an overhang of granite that offered modest shelter from the northwest, and sat with her back against the rock and ate bread she'd brought and looked at the parcel until the light went. The second time was the following morning, before dawn. She went to the market in Dunrath village, a loose collection of stalls that gathered twice weekly on a muddy square near the mill, and she spent nearly all the money she had on 4 things: a good iron crowbar, a pair of leather work gloves, a length of rope, and a small bag of lime mortar mix that she had to argue with the merchant about, because he had initially refused to believe she intended to use it herself. "Mortar work is," he started. "4 pence for the bag," she said. "It's not a simple—" "4 pence." He sold her the bag. She carried everything up the hill in one trip, the crowbar slung through the rope and across her shoulders, the mortar bag balanced against her hip, the gloves already on because the crowbar was cold. She did not start building that day. She spent the day walking the parcel again, more slowly this time, with the crowbar. She used it to probe soil depth at different points. She poured a small amount of water from her canteen at 3 different locations and watched where it went. She stood at the site she'd identified the day before, a slight depression in the northeast face of the largest granite outcropping, angled in a way that would break the direct wind line. And she stood there for a long time, doing nothing that anyone watching would have recognized as productive. She was working out angles in her head, where the wind hit the rock face, where it split, where the dead space was, the zone of relative stillness that forms on the lee side of any large obstruction, if you understand how to read it. Her grandmother had called these the quiet places. The wind goes around, she'd said. It always goes around. You just have to find where it goes. Alara found it. The spot was perhaps 3 feet to the left of where the obvious choice would have been, where anyone looking for a sheltered building site would have placed a structure. The obvious choice had better light and slightly more level ground, but the obvious choice put the building just inside the turbulence zone where split wind reconverged, which in practice meant that any structure there would experience maximum pressure rather than minimum. 3 feet to the left, you were in the quiet. She drove the crowbar into the soil at the corner points of a rectangle she measured with her rope. Then she sat down and ate the rest of her bread and looked at what she'd marked out and made a few small adjustments. One corner shifted slightly to change the angle of the long wall relative to the wind. Then she looked at it again and made one more adjustment. Then she was done deciding. She broke ground on a Wednesday. The first task was not building. The first task was moving stone. The parcel had more of it than it needed, and she spent 4 full days doing nothing except pulling rock out of the slope with the crowbar, sorting by size and shape, and organizing it into rough categories along what would eventually be the building site. Large flat stones for the foundation course, mid-sized irregular pieces for the main wall runs, smaller stones for fill and chinking, longest, flattest pieces set aside separately for lintels and thresholds. It was brutal work. The crowbar was heavy and the rocks were heavier, and the soil gripped them in the particular way that northern soil grips things it has held for a long time. Her hands blistered under the gloves, then the blisters burst and calloused over, and by the 4th day she stopped noticing them. Her back ached from her shoulders to her hips every evening. She ate small meals and slept under the granite overhang, wrapped in a blanket and a length of canvas she'd found among Thomas's stored equipment, and woke before light, and worked. She did not speak to anyone during this period. Nobody came up to speak to her. Below the ridge, in Dunrath, she was already a subject of discussion. She understood this without needing to hear it, because communities like Dunrath had a particular way of processing anomaly. They talked about it collectively until they had produced an explanation that allowed them to continue. A young widow doing something unexpected on a hillside required explanation, and the explanation the community settled on was the simple one: grief. She was grieving. Perhaps not in her right mind. She'd come down when the weather got bad enough, or when she ran out of food, or when the cold made the choice for her. The Blackthorn household had a more specific theory. Callum had mentioned to his wife Margaret that the widow was up on the north parcel doing something with stones, and Margaret had told her friend Agnes Holt, who kept the post office, and Agnes had mentioned it to the Reverend Macaulay when he came to collect a parcel, and from the Reverend it had reached the general population of Dunrath with the speed that information always achieves in small communities. By the end of Alara's first week on the parcel, most of Dunrath had heard that she was building something. The specific nature of what she was building varied in each retelling, but the general consensus, which had crystallized around something Callum Blackthorn said at a dinner attended by 6 other valley families, was that whatever she was building, it would not stand through winter. The slope pitch alone, Callum said. Drainage will undercut any foundation she puts in, and the northwest exposure up there, a first serious gale, will strip anything she builds without proper anchoring. And anchoring properly takes equipment she hasn't got and skill she... He paused, conscious of the dinner table. She was a farmer's wife, not a mason. The men around the table nodded. This was not unkindness. This was assessment based on information they believed they had. They knew the north slope. They knew what it took to build on difficult ground. They knew that masonry was a profession requiring years of apprenticeship, and the Dunn woman, whatever her qualities, had not served one. Roderick Finch, who owned the village's small lumber operation and had rebuilt his own barn twice in 20 years, put it plainly. She'll need shelter before she has shelter. That's her problem. We'll send something up, Edmund Blackthorn said. He was not a cruel man. Blankets. Some food. When she's ready to be sensible. He said this with confidence because, in his experience, the world eventually required people to be sensible. On day 9, Alara started laying the foundation. She had spent the previous 2 days doing something that would have puzzled anyone watching even more than the stone sorting had. She had poured water, slowly from her canteen, refilled at the spring above, at precise points along the marked perimeter of her building, and watched very carefully where it moved. Water finds the truth of ground. Her grandmother had told her this when she was 6, standing in the rain outside a neighbour's poorly built cottage, watching the water pool against the north wall because the foundation had been laid level in ground that wasn't. Water finds the truth, and then it exploits it. Everything the builder got wrong, the water will find. Alara's foundation perimeter had one point where water moved slightly south rather than downhill. She stared at this for a long time. Then she dug down at that point with the crowbar and found what she'd suspected, a subsurface shelf of rock angled slightly the wrong way. She adjusted the perimeter, 8 inches east, one corner reshaped entirely. Then she laid the first course. Foundation stones went in with a care that someone watching might have found excessive. She tested each stone's stability before mortaring it. She used mortar sparingly, not as a structural element, but as a sealer, filling gaps that would otherwise channel water. The real structure was stone against stone, weight against weight, each piece selected to distribute load rather than concentrate it. She worked slowly, she didn't care. A wall built fast that fails in February is not a wall, it's a problem waiting to become an emergency. Her grandmother's voice, clear as water, in the back of her mind. By day 12, she had one complete foundation course and part of a second. Her hands had stopped hurting. Her back had stopped hurting. She'd stopped being able to measure time in anything except the progress of the wall. Below, in Dunrath, October deepened. The temperature dropped measurably each week. Leaves stripped from the deciduous trees along the valley floor in 2 days of driving rain, and afterward the hillsides looked skeletal and exposed. Farmers brought animals inside earlier than planned. The Blackthorns received a delivery of coal, 4 tons, enough to see the household through even a hard winter. Nobody came up the north slope. At night, Alara lay under the granite overhang with her canvas over her and listened to the wind work its way across the ridge. She could hear the variance in it, the way it shifted direction between midnight and 4 in the morning, the way it dropped in the hour before dawn only to come back stronger. She was learning the hillside's patterns the way you learn a person's patterns, through repetition and attention. She filed everything away. She'd need it. Winter had not arrived yet, but standing outside one evening in the last of the October light, looking north at the sky above the ridge, Alara Dunn could see that it was coming. The clouds were the wrong shape. The cold had a quality to it that was different from October cold, something harder and more committed behind it. She looked at her foundation, 18 inches high along one full wall, and barely started on the others. She thought about what still needed doing. She went back to work. The second course went up faster than the first. Not because she rushed, because she had stopped second-guessing the ground. The foundation had settled into its bed of packed earth and granite over 2 weeks of October frost. And when Alara pressed her palm flat against the base stones each morning, a habit now, automatic as checking the sky, they gave back nothing. No shift, no flex, just cold rock sitting where she'd put it, doing what she'd asked it to do. She took this as information, not as comfort. The wall system she was building used a technique her grandmother had called double skin, 2 parallel faces of fitted stone with a core of smaller rubble packed tight between them. A single skin wall of this thickness would have been faster and used less material. It would also, in the kind of wind that came off the northwest ridge in February, behave roughly like a sail. The double skin distributed pressure through the mass of the wall rather than against its face. When the wind pushed, it pushed against weight, not surface. This required twice the stone, twice the fitting work, twice the time. She had not told anyone this was what she was building. Nobody had asked. November came in cold and dry, which felt like a gift until she understood it wasn't. Dry cold in early November in this part of Scotland meant the moisture was being stored somewhere in the atmosphere, accumulating in systems moving in from the North Atlantic, waiting for the right convergence of temperature and pressure. Dry cold was not mild cold. It was cold that had not yet decided what it intended to become. She worked faster without rushing. The distinction mattered. The east wall was at 4 feet when it happened. She'd been fitting a long, flat-faced stone into the third course of the outer skin, a piece she'd specifically set aside 2 weeks earlier because of its length and the way its bottom face sat flush without needing a shim. She mortared the bed beneath it. She lifted it into position. She tested its seating with both palms, checking all 4 bearing points. She let go. The crack was not loud. It was a small, dry sound, like a knuckle popping. She heard it and went still before she fully understood what it meant. The stone she'd just placed had fractured along an internal fault she hadn't seen. The break ran diagonal from corner to corner. The 2 halves sat in the wall like a split tooth, neither half stable, both halves compromising the course below and the bearing surface for the course above. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the course below. Then the course above that had not yet been laid. Then the length of wall extending east from this point, which now had a fractured linchpin in its third course 8 feet from the corner. She sat down on the ground next to the wall. She sat there for perhaps 10 minutes, not moving, looking at the break. She was not resting. She was thinking through every implication of what had just happened, working the problem forward and backward, tracing consequence the way you trace water flow. Wherever it goes, go with it until you see where it ends up. Where it ended up was not good. The east wall was her longest run. 4 courses of careful work, almost 60 individual stones placed and fitted. The interior pressure of the double skin depended on the courses above and below staying in compression. A diagonal fracture at the third course of the outer skin meant the compression path was broken. The wall above would now bear unevenly on the two half-stones, and the mortar alone, which was the filler, not the structure, would not hold it, not through a winter, not through the first serious freeze-thaw cycle. She would have to take it down, not the fractured stone, the 4 courses above it which hadn't been laid yet, the fractured stone, and the 3 courses below it back to the corner. She did the count in her head, 31 stones, 2.5 weeks of work. She started pulling them down before she'd fully finished counting. Word reached Dunrath that the widow's wall had come down. The actual information was relayed by a boy named Piers, who had climbed the slope on a dare from 2 older boys, and had returned wide-eyed with news that the woman was tearing her own wall apart, pulling stones out and stacking them to the side in a new arrangement, which Piers described as like she was starting the whole thing over from scratch. This reached Callum Blackthorne by early evening. He mentioned it to his father at dinner. Edmund Blackthorne set down his fork and was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had confirmed a suspicion he'd held for some time and took no pleasure in. "Wall failure," he said. "Sounds like it." "I said the drainage would undercut the foundation." "You did." Edmund picked up his fork again. "Send up some food tomorrow and tell Donal to take the spare tent canvas we used for the harvest. She can make do with that. And," he paused, "tell her there's the old with empty cottage through winter if she wants it. She'd have to do work for the lease, but it's shelter." Callum carried this offer up the slope himself the following morning, which was not something he'd planned to do, and which he told himself was efficiency. He found Alara on the east side of the building site. She was not tearing down. She was laying stone, slowly, at a different angle than what Piers had reported to the dinner table the night before. She was rebuilding. But the configuration had changed. Callum stood at the boundary marker and looked at what she was doing. He couldn't identify exactly what was different from his vantage point. Something about the angle of the wall face, or possibly the thickness. "Mrs. Dunn?" She looked up. Then she went back to the stone she was fitting. "Mrs. Dunn, my father wanted me to pass on—" "I heard you." She tested the stone's bearing, adjusted it 1/2 inch, pressed it flat. "What does he want?" Callum explained the offer. The old with cottage through winter, work in exchange for lease. He kept his tone practical, which he thought was considerate. She didn't respond immediately. She mortared the stone she'd just seated and moved to the next position. "Mrs. Dunn, the wall didn't fail because of drainage," she said. He stopped. "The foundation's fine. A stone split. Internal fault, but it looked solid from the outside." She glanced at him briefly. "That happens. The drainage on this slope is—" "I'll show you the foundation if you want to look at it." He didn't move toward the building site. "I'm not suggesting you don't have some skill with—" "You don't have to suggest anything," she said. "I'm telling you the foundation is good. You can look at it or not. Up to you." There was a pause. Callum Blackthorne was 32 years old and not accustomed to being offered the chance to look at evidence. He was accustomed to people taking his assessment as a reasonable starting point. It was a subtle difference, but it registered. "The offer stands," he said. "The old with cottage. If this becomes—" he searched for the word— "impractical." "Thank you for coming up," she said. He waited another moment, then walked back down the slope. He had the distinct and faintly irritating feeling that he had been neither dismissed nor argued with, and that this was somehow worse than either. The stone she'd pulled the east wall down to was the bad one. She extracted it in 2 pieces, placed them to the side. They'd be useful as chinking material, the small broken pieces especially, and examined the cavity they'd left. The base courses beneath the fracture point were exactly as she'd laid them. No settlement, no shift. She ran her fingers along the mortar lines and found them intact, dense, no crumbling at the joins. The foundation was not the problem. Her grandmother had told her about false stone, rock that looked sound, but carried internal stress lines from the way it had fractured long ago. Under glacial pressure or heat or some violence the landscape had absorbed centuries back and never fully released. You couldn't always see it, you couldn't always feel it. Sometimes you placed it and it held for years. Sometimes you placed it and it failed on the 3rd day. "The stone doesn't lie," her grandmother had said. "It just doesn't always tell you everything at once." The new stone she selected for the repaired third course came from the largest outcropping on the parcel, which she hadn't quarried from yet because it required the most work to extract pieces from. She spent a full day working the outcropping with the crowbar, reading the grain of the rock the way you read wood grain, looking for the natural cleavage lines, working with them rather than against them. What came out this way was heavier and more irregular than surface stone, but it was deep rock, and deep rock from a granite outcropping that had been sitting undisturbed for 10,000 years had generally worked through whatever internal stress it was going to work through. She rebuilt the east wall's 3 lower courses in 4 days, taking half a day longer than the first time because she checked each stone differently now. Not just the bearing surfaces and the face, the interior as much as she could assess it, listening to the ring when she tapped it with the crowbar. Solid rock gave a different sound than faulted rock. Not always, not perfectly, but enough. The rebuilt courses looked from the outside nearly identical to what had been there before. The difference was internal, slightly thicker core rubble at the fracture zone, packed tighter to distribute the load path around any future failure point. The outer face set at a 2-degree batter, a slight inward lean, that she'd calculated would let the wall shed wind pressure more efficiently than a plumb face. She hadn't done this on the first attempt. She hadn't been certain enough of the wind angles then. 14 days of November had taught her more about how the north slope moved air than she'd understood from the initial observation, and she incorporated it without ceremony. The wall went back up. She did not feel relieved. She felt accurate. The first significant weather arrived on the 14th of November. Not the main event. She understood that from the feel of it, but a preliminary. 3 days of hard, driving rain that came at the hillside on a 15-degree angle from the northwest, which meant it came directly at the unfinished north wall, which had no roof yet and was barely 4 courses high. She built a temporary windbreak of stacked loose stone to the north and west of the build site and lashed canvas over the open structure to protect the fresh mortar from the rain. The mortar needed 10 days minimum to cure properly. Rain in the first week would compromise it. The windbreak worked, not perfectly. She spent the 3 days in the rain standing at points around the structure, watching where water penetrated and blocking it with additional stone or canvas repositioning. By the end of the 3rd day, she was doing this by reflex, moving to a new gap before the water arrived at it, because she could read the wind's angle changes and knew where the pressure would land before it landed. She was soaked through for 3 days. She slept in 4-hour intervals under the only dry section of canvas pressed against the interior of what would eventually be the building's south wall, which was the highest completed wall and the one most sheltered from the northwest. The temperature dropped to just above freezing at night. She didn't come down from the slope. Roderick Finch went up on the 19th of November because his wife had told him twice that someone should check, and he'd agreed with her both times, and the 3rd time she'd said it, she'd accompanied the statement with a look that resolved the matter. Finch was 53, built solidly through the chest and shoulders from decades of lumber work, and he had genuinely no idea what he expected to find on the north parcel. He'd built his own barn twice and understood structural work at the level of practical necessity, enough to know when something looked wrong. He was not an engineer. He was not an architect. He was a man who worked with material and understood its properties through long repetition. He reached the parcel boundary and stopped. The structure was not what he'd imagined. He'd expected something rough, walls of stacked stone with no real system, the kind of improvised shelter a desperate person builds when they need cover immediately, uneven courses, gapped joints, corners that didn't properly key. What he was looking at was something else. The walls, on the 3 completed sides, were even in course height. The corners were properly keyed, each course alternating which face stone extended into the corner, which was how you built corners that didn't separate under lateral pressure. He could see the double skin on the open north end, where the wall wasn't finished yet, the 2 faces running parallel with packed rubble between them, which he'd seen done on farm buildings along the coast, but had never seen done this far inland, because it required considerably more material and time. He stood there in this cold afternoon light and looked at it for a while. Alara was working on the north wall. She'd registered his arrival, but hadn't acknowledged it beyond a brief upward glance. She was fitting a long lintel stone over what would be the window opening in the east wall, the last major structural piece she needed before she could start the roof frame. He watched her for a few minutes. She tested the lintel stone's bearing at both ends. She checked the level with a small tool he couldn't make out clearly at this distance. She made an adjustment. She checked it again. "That's a double-skin wall," he said. "Yes." "I haven't seen that up here. Usually it's—" He stopped. "Too much work," she said. "Too much material, mostly. I've got the material." He walked along the south wall slowly, looking at the courses. The mortar lines were neat and consistent. He pressed on the wall face with one hand, testing for movement the way you'd test a fence post. Nothing moved. "You've got the corner keying right," he said. There was something almost reluctant in how he said it, like he'd checked for it specifically expecting to find it wrong. "My grandmother taught me corners first," Alara said. "She said if you can't do the corners, you shouldn't be doing walls." Finch looked at the corner in question. He looked at the alternating courses, the way the perpendicular faces locked into each other. Then he looked at the window lintel she was fitting. "That piece is going to take the full load of the wall above it." "I know." "The bearing length on each end? 8 inches minimum, both sides? I know." He stopped, looked at her. She was still working, not looking at him. He'd come up expecting to find something he'd need to intervene in, because that was the role he'd assigned himself in making the walk up here, and the role was no longer available to him. He stood there for a moment in the cold, in the late November light. "You need roof timber," he said. "Yes." "What dimensions?" She told him without looking up from the lintel. The spans, the pitch she was planning, the rafter count. He listened without writing anything down, which meant he was committing it to memory, which meant he intended to do something with it. She didn't thank him. She continued fitting the lintel stone. "I've got some lengths that came off the Oldwith rebuild," Finch said, "stored in the yard. They'd go to waste otherwise." She looked up at him then, briefly. "I'd need to pay for them," she said. "Probably not right away. But eventually." "Eventually," he agreed. She looked back at the lintel. "All right." He nodded, turned, and started back down the slope without additional comment. Halfway to the boundary marker, he stopped and looked back at the structure. From this angle, from below, you could see how the building site related to the large granite outcropping, how the northwest face of the rock would deflect wind away from the building's most exposed corner. He hadn't noticed this from above. From above, it looked like the building was simply placed near the outcropping because that was where there happened to be flat enough ground. From below, you could see that the outcropping was not incidental. The building was positioned deliberately inside the outcropping's wind shadow, at the exact depth where the turbulence shed off the rock's shoulder, rather than the zone where it reconverged. He stood there in this cold for a moment, looking at this. Then he walked down to the road. December came quietly. That was the wrong word for it. December came in the borderlands north of Inverness the way a debt comes due, without drama, but with absolute certainty. The temperature fell through the last week of November and kept falling into the first week of December, until the ground froze to a depth that made the crowbar ring against it like a bell. The spring above the parcel, which had been running clear and fast all autumn, slowed to a trickle and then disappeared, sealed somewhere beneath the frost. Alara had anticipated this. She had stored water in the large crockery jugs she'd traded a week's worth of wall work at a neighbouring farm to obtain. She had the timber Finch had sent up. 4 boys from his yard delivered it on a flat cart and left it at the boundary marker without coming further. Whether from instruction or from their own uncertainty, she didn't know. She had the south and east and west walls standing at roof height. She had the lintel in place. She had no roof yet. The roof frame went up over 3 days of cold that made her fingers stiff inside the gloves, and required her to stop every 20 minutes and press her hands under her arms to bring the feeling back. She worked alone. The timber was heavier than she'd expected at this dimension, and she moved each rafter by herself, using a combination of the rope and 2 long branches cut to serve as props while she positioned the main beam. The main ridge beam was the hardest piece. It took her most of a day alone to get it seated and braced. By the time it was in position, she was moving purely on the logic of the task, her body doing what her mind had worked out in advance, her arms doing what needed to be done with a kind of exhausted precision that did not feel like strength and was not the absence of it either. When the ridge beam seated and held, she stood on the north wall and looked at the skeleton of the roof against the grey December sky, and she could see what the building was going to be, not what it was now, incomplete, roofless on the north side still, exposed to the sky that had turned the colour of iron. What it was going to be. She came down off the wall and went back to work. Above the ridge, the sky was doing something new. She had been watching it for 3 days. The cloud structure coming in from the northwest had a different architecture than November weather. Thicker and lower, moving with a density that suggested the moisture load was enormous. The temperature had dropped another 4 degrees in the last 48 hours. The wind had gone almost entirely calm in the last day, which in her experience was not a relief. Calm before a serious winter event was the atmosphere holding its breath. She worked through the last of the available light, and then she stopped and looked at what she had left to do. She had the north wall's final 2 courses, the roof's remaining rafter spans on the north pitch. The thatch material she'd cut and bundled from the lower slope was stacked against the east wall. Not enough of it yet. The doorframe wasn't in, the floor was frozen earth. She thought about Finch descending the slope and stopping to look back at the way the granite outcropping sat relative to the building. She thought about what the sky looked like. She went back to work in the dark. By the light of a tallow candle set inside a small lantern of pierced tin that she'd brought up in October and which threw enough light to work by, if she stayed within 4 feet of it. The candle burned down. She lit another. The building wasn't finished. The weather was not waiting. The candle went out. Not from wind. There was no wind yet. It simply burned down to the tin and stopped. And the darkness that replaced it was total. No moon, no stars, cloud cover so complete and low that the hillside had no depth to it, just black pressing against black. Alara stayed where she was for a moment, on her knees on the frozen floor of the unfinished building, her hands still holding the bundle of thatch she'd been working with. She could feel the cold coming up through the ground into her knees. A different cold than yesterday, heavier, wetter inside it despite the dry air. She went to sleep. The sound woke her at some hour before dawn, not wind, not yet. A sound she had no word for, a low, structural groan from the hillside itself, as if the frozen ground was settling under new weight. She lay still and listened to it. It came from the north, from above the spring line. Then she heard the spring. It had been silent for 8 days. Now it was running again, which meant the temperature above the freeze line had changed, which meant the system coming in from the northwest had pushed warmer air ahead of it, at altitude even as the surface temperature dropped further. She understood what this meant. The moisture load in the incoming weather was going to fall as snow, not rain, a lot of it. And then it was going to get colder. She got up. The roof was not finished. She worked by feel in the dark, which was not as difficult as it should have been because her hands knew the materials by now. The weight of each rafter, the texture of the bundled thatch, the resistance of the rope when she lashed a course down. She worked the north pitch of the roof, the last unfinished section, moving by touch and by the knowledge of what needed to happen. And when the first grey light came up around 6 in the morning, she could see what she'd done in the dark and found it acceptable. Not done, but closer. The sky in the north was the colour of a bruise. It started snowing at 9 in the morning, lightly at first, the small, dry, fast-moving flakes that come ahead of the main system, almost like a formality. She worked through it. By 10, the flakes were larger and slower, and the visibility on the slope had dropped to perhaps 40 yards. By 11, she couldn't see the boundary marker. She kept working. The thatch still needed its top course and ridge capping. The north wall had one final course of stone unfinished. She'd decided, at first light, she could leave it, that the roof line would protect the top of the wall adequately. She was now unsure if the snow load on the north pitch built faster than the roof pitch could shed it. She did the calculation in her head. The pitch angle she'd set was steep enough, 28 degrees. Snow would slide at 22 in most conditions. She'd done this deliberately. She'd done it weeks ago, before she knew exactly when this would arrive, because her grandmother had told her that roof pitch is decided in summer and proven in winter, and you don't get a second chance on that particular number. She finished the ridge capping at noon. The wind arrived at 1. It did not build gradually. That was what she registered first. Not that the wind increased, but that it simply appeared at full force, as if it had been held somewhere and released. 1 minute she was working in heavy snow with minimal air movement. The next minute the snow was horizontal and the sound was a sustained note that filled the entire hillside. A low harmonic produced by wind moving over the ridge above at a speed she had never personally experienced. She got inside. The door frame was in, but she had no door, just a canvas hung over the opening with rope. She pulled it across and pressed the rope tight and stood inside the building with her back against the south wall and listened to what was happening outside. The noise was not like weather she'd heard before. It wasn't the variable howl of ordinary winter storms, rising and falling with gusts. This was a constant industrial roar with gusts layered on top of it, each gust a sudden pressure increase that she could feel even inside the walls as a change in the air. The canvas over the door strained against its lashing. She crossed to it and added 2 more rope ties, working by feel in the dim interior. Inside the unfinished building, the temperature was close to freezing. Outside, she estimated it was well below. The wind chill beyond the walls was a number she didn't calculate because the calculation wasn't useful. She found a crack in the north wall's mortar, a gap at a joint in the 7th course that had looked acceptable 2 weeks ago and now had cold air moving through it in a thin, precise stream. She packed it with a strip of canvas and spare mortar she'd kept soft inside a covered pot near the floor. She found 2 more gaps. She sealed them. Then she sat down in the corner of the south wall and east wall, the building's most sheltered interior point, and pulled her canvas over herself and waited. Blackthorn House was 400 yards down the slope and 300 yards east. It had 4 chimneys, all drawing hard. The household had burned through what Alara estimated, based on the smoke volume she'd observed in the weeks before the storm, was roughly half a ton of coal in the first week of December alone. At that rate, the 4-ton delivery should have lasted through February. She had not calculated this for any purpose. It was simply what her mind did with information. At 2 in the afternoon of the storm's first day, the wind shifted. It came now from slightly north of northwest, 8 or 10 degrees of rotation, which in ordinary weather would be unremarkable. On this hillside with this topology, it meant the wind was no longer hitting the south face of Blackthorn House obliquely. It was hitting the west face directly. Alara knew this because she had walked every part of this hillside in October. She had not walked it with the Blackthorn House in mind. She had walked it understanding that the wind's behavior across a landscape is not uniform, that ridgelines and slope angles create channels and dead zones and pressure anomalies that differ by position, sometimes by only a few yards. She had walked it to understand her own site, but you cannot understand one part of a landscape without understanding the whole. The west face of Blackthorn House had 3 large windows. They were single glazed, set in timber frames that had dried and contracted over 30 years of seasons. The frames had been repainted but not resealed in at least a decade. She'd noticed this in the weeks when she'd occasionally passed below the house on her way to and from the village. The gaps around the glazing were visible from 30 feet away. She thought about those gaps now, sitting in the interior of her stone building, listening to the wind. Her own walls had no gaps. Not now. She'd spent 6 weeks ensuring they didn't. Inside Blackthorn House, the west-facing parlour had become uninhabitable by 3 in the afternoon. Margaret Blackthorn, Callum's wife, had moved the household to the east-facing sitting room after the parlour's largest window began flexing visibly in its frame. A slow, rhythmic distortion with each gust that produced a sound like a drumhead being struck. She'd told the children this was precautionary. The children had believed her. Edmund Blackthorn stood in the east corridor and felt the cold coming through the west wall as a pervasive chill that the corridor fire couldn't address. The wall itself was not leaking. The timber plank construction was sound enough. But timber breathes. Stone doesn't. At the temperatures and wind speeds now acting on the west face, a timber wall of this construction allowed infiltration not through specific gaps, but through the material itself. Cold air finding its way through the plank grain and into the interior in a volume that no fire of manageable size could entirely overcome. He understood this. He had always understood that his house had this characteristic. In normal winters, normal fires were sufficient. He had made a calculation years ago about what was normal. This winter was revising that calculation. By 4 in the afternoon, the coal consumption in Blackthorn House had reached a rate that Callum, doing figures in the ledger book he kept for household accounts, calculated would exhaust the remaining supply by mid-January. He did not share this with his father immediately. He sat with it for an hour, checking the numbers twice, before going to find him. Edmund looked at the numbers. He said nothing. On the slope above, Alara's building held 38 degrees Fahrenheit inside its walls. Outside, the temperature was 11 degrees. The wind speed she could not measure exactly, but the sound and behavior of the snow, driven horizontally, accumulating on vertical surfaces as well as horizontal ones, suggested sustained wind speeds above 40 miles per hour with gusts considerably higher. 38 to 11, a difference of 27 degrees maintained by stone walls averaging 22 inches thick, a thatch roof 2 feet deep at the ridge, and the body heat of one person and no fire. She had not built a fire. She hadn't needed one. She knew she should eat something. She opened her food stores, dried meat, hard bread, 2 small wrapped portions of cheese she'd been rationing, and ate carefully, without hurry. Eating was maintenance. The building was doing what buildings were supposed to do, which was extend the conditions inside beyond what was happening outside, and her job inside the building was to remain functional. She lay down on the ground inside the southeast corner, canvas over her, and slept for 4 hours. The storm ran for 2.5 days. Not continuous at full force, there were periods of reduced intensity, 6 or 8 hours, where the wind dropped to something manageable and the snow fell vertically instead of horizontally. She used these periods. She went outside and cleared the north-facing snow accumulation from the base of the walls, because snow pressed against a wall base for extended periods could force moisture into the mortar course over a freeze-thaw cycle. She checked the roof thatch along the ridge where she'd been uncertain about the capping work she'd done in the dark. The ridge was intact, the lashing had held. She checked the south wall's exterior face. She had built this wall at the same 2-degree batter as the rebuilt east wall. Snow had built up against it to perhaps 2 feet at the base, but the wall face above the snow line was clean. The inward lean shed, the driven snow, rather than collecting it. She looked at the wall for a moment. She had calculated the batter angle in October with a crowbar and a piece of rope, using a technique her grandmother had shown her, using a plumb line and a stick. She had not been certain it was right. She had been as certain as the information available to her allowed. Those were different things, and the difference between them had bothered her intermittently for weeks. The wall was clean. She went back inside. On the second night, Finch's lumberyard caught a partial roof collapse. The south section of the main storage shed, which he'd been planning to repair since autumn and had not gotten to, came down under snow load at approximately 11 at night. He heard it from the house, a sustained creak followed by a single loud crack, and then silence. He went out in the dark with a lantern and found 6 feet of roof decking folded inward over the rear of the shed, taking 3 stored timber lengths with it. He stood in the dark and the snow and the residual wind and looked at this. He thought about the thatch ridge he'd seen on the stone building up on the north slope, the pitch angle of it, the lashing pattern. He went back inside and did not sleep well. The storm ended on the afternoon of the 3rd day. It ended the way it had started, not gradually, but suddenly. The wind stopped inside an hour, the cloud cover broke from the northwest, and by late afternoon the hillside above Dunrath was in clear winter light, the snow so bright under the low sun that it was difficult to look at directly. Alara came out of the building and stood in the light and looked at what had happened to the landscape. The snow was deep, knee-deep on open ground, deeper in the lee of obstacles. The slope above her building had shed its snow in 2 large slabs that had peeled off and come to rest approximately 30 feet below the building, which was the correct side and the correct distance. She had thought about this in October, about what a snowshed event on the slope above would do, and had positioned the building outside the likely run-out zone. The building itself had perhaps 8 inches of snow on the roof. She watched a section of it slide as she stood there peeling off the steep thatch pitch in a controlled sheet that fell cleanly to the north and away. She checked the exterior walls. All 4 faces, no mortar loss, no visible crack propagation. The north wall's top course, the one she'd left unfinished, the decision that had worried her, had performed adequately because the roof eave overhung it by 4 inches and shed the wind-driven snow away from the raw top course. 4 inches. She had set that eave dimension in November, in the dark, working by feel. She went back inside and sat down on the floor. She sat there for a long time without moving. She was not resting. She was doing what she always did after something important. She was going back through every decision in sequence, checking where the luck was and where the calculation was. Because those were different things, and it mattered which was which. If the eave dimension had been 4 inches, because she'd measured it right, she could rely on it. If it had been 4 inches because the timber happened to be cut to a length that produced 4 inches, she needed to know that. She went back through the measurement in her memory. The timber length, her arm span she'd used as a reference measure, the mark she'd made on the wall. It had been 4 inches because she'd measured it. She sat with that for a moment, then she got up. Finch came up the slope on the morning of the 4th day. The snow had crusted overnight, and his footsteps broke through it at irregular intervals as he climbed, which made the walk slower than it would have been otherwise. He was breathing hard when he reached the boundary marker. The stone building sat in the winter light with smoke coming from the small chimney she'd built into the east wall. She had lit a fire now, the first one. Not from necessity, but because the walls were proven and she could. The smoke rose straight up in the still air. He stood at the boundary marker for a moment, looking at the building. The walls were unmarked by the storm. The roof had shed cleanly. The north face, the face that had taken the wind's full force for 2.5 days, showed nothing. No mortar loss, no cracks in the face stone. He walked up to the building. Alara came out of the door as he approached. She was carrying a small wooden bowl. She looked at him, then looked at the south wall, then looked at the roof. "Your yard," she said. "South section came down," he said, "so snow load." He paused. "Was planning to fix it." She nodded. He looked at the north wall. He walked to it and put his hand flat against the stone face. He pressed. The wall did not move. He looked at the mortar lines, the course heights, the corner key on the northeast. "How warm inside today," he said. 38, roughly, through the storm. No fire until this morning." He was quiet. "Outside was 11, she said. Second night." He took his hand off the wall. She said nothing. He looked at the building for another long moment. From this angle, the relationship between the structure and the granite outcropping was completely clear. The building's northwest corner sat precisely in the outcropping's wind shadow. The shadow that had kept the wind force against that corner at a fraction of what it had been on open ground, which was what had allowed the unfinished top course to survive what would otherwise have been direct assault. "The corner," he said. "You put it there deliberately." She looked at him. "Against the rock," he said. "That angle. You put it there for the wind." "Yes," she said. He looked back at the wall. He looked at the corner. He looked at the outcropping and the gap between it and the building and the angle of the outcropping's northwest face and the direction from which the wind had come. He had one more question. He stood there in the cold, working up to it, and she waited, and the smoke from her chimney went straight up in the still air between them. "How did you know?" he said, where the quiet was. She looked at the outcropping, then at the building, then back at him. "My grandmother showed me," she said. He nodded slowly. He didn't ask the next question. He stood there in the bright, cold morning with his hand still carrying the memory of the wall's solidity, and the building stood in the light exactly as she'd built it. And the question he hadn't asked hung in the air between them like the smoke. Neither of them said anything else. Callum Blackthorne came up the slope 9 days after the storm. He didn't send anyone ahead. He didn't mention to his father that he was going. He put on his heaviest coat in the early morning before the household was fully awake, and he walked up through the crusted snow alone. And he carried nothing. No food package, no formal offer, none of the props that had accompanied his previous visit. He came with his hands in his pockets and his breath visible in the cold air, and no stated purpose, which was unusual for him. He reached the boundary marker and stopped. He stood there for a long time. The building was not what he'd built in his mind over the preceding weeks. The mental image he'd been carrying of a rough shelter, walls uneven and patched, something that had survived through fortune rather than design. The structure in front of him was compact and deliberate. The walls were even in height around the full perimeter. The roof sat at a pitch that had clearly been chosen rather than defaulted to. The chimney, small, set into the east wall, was drawing, a thin line of smoke rising straight in the still morning air. The north face was what stopped him longest. The north face had taken the full force of the storm for 2.5 days. He had been in Blackthorn House during those same 2.5 days, feeding coal into fires that couldn't keep the west corridor above 45 degrees, listening to the west parlour window flex and drum in its frame. The north face of the stone building on the hill above him showed nothing. No mortar loss along the courses, no crack lines propagating from the corners. The face stone was clean and tight, same as the day it had been laid. He had come up here expecting, without fully admitting it to himself, to find something he could assess honestly as insufficient. A partial success. Something that had worked well enough but revealed its limits under serious conditions. He was looking at something that had not revealed any limits. He stood in the cold for another minute. Then he walked up to the building and knocked on the door frame, which still had canvas over it rather than a proper door. Alara pulled the canvas aside. She looked at him. He looked at her. Behind her, the interior of the building was dim, lit by the small window in the east wall and the low fire in the hearth. He could see the floor, packed earth swept clean, a sleeping area in the south corner. A stack of supplies along the west wall, organized with a neatness that suggested not tidiness, but the practical logic of knowing where everything was in the dark. He could feel the warmth coming from the interior, not dramatic warmth, steady warmth. The kind that meant the temperature had been maintained rather than generated. No spike near the hearth and cold everywhere else, just an even temperature throughout the interior that met him at the doorway like something that had been there a long time. "Mr. Blackthorne?" she said. "Mrs. Dunn?" He looked past her at the interior, then back at the exterior walls. He put his hand flat against the east wall, same as Finch had done 9 days earlier. The stone was cold on the surface, but not the deep cold of a wall that had been losing heat through it. "Can I—" She stepped aside. He came in. He stood in the interior and looked at the walls from inside. At the ceiling, the thatch overhead, deep and close, with no visible sky through it. At the corners were the courses keyed together, and the interior face was as neatly fitted as the exterior. He looked at the small hearth, which was built into the east wall with a back slope that directed heat into the room rather than up the chimney. He looked at it for a moment because it was not a design he'd seen before. Most hearths in the valley were open-fronted, which was simple to build and lost most of the combustion heat straight up. He didn't say anything about it. He stood in the interior for perhaps 2 minutes, turning slowly, looking at the walls and the roof and the floor and the hearth. Alara stood near the doorway and didn't speak. Then he walked back out. She followed him. He stood outside with his back to the east wall, facing the slope below, looking down at the valley. His house was visible from here, the Blackthorne mansion, its roofline, the 4 chimneys, all of which had been drawing hard for 3 weeks. From this distance it looked exactly as it always had. Large, well-positioned, on the sheltered eastern slope, solid. He stood looking at it for long enough that it became something other than casual observation. "The west corridor," he said finally. 3 days we couldn't use it. Alara said nothing. "We went through—" He stopped, started again. The coal consumption was more than it should have been. She waited. He turned and looked at the north wall of her building again. "Your walls are 22 inches. At the base, 20 at the top course. Ours are—" He knew the answer. He'd built the addition on the north wing himself, 12 years ago. 14, single skin, timber interior lining. Yes. He looked at the north wall. He looked at the corner where it met the granite outcropping's shadow. He was doing what she'd done in October on his family's house, reading it from the outside, understanding what it would do under specific conditions. He said, "It held." Not a question, 2 words. The shortest sentence he'd produced in any conversation she'd observed him have, and it carried the weight of everything he'd assumed before it. "Yes," she said. Finch came up 2 days later, but he didn't come alone. He brought a young man named Ewan Alcott, who was 26 and had recently taken over his father's failed tenant farm on the valley's west side, the one that the elder Alcott had never managed to make pay despite 20 years of effort. Ewan was lean and quiet, and had the look of someone who had spent most of his life being told what wasn't possible. He stood at the boundary marker while Finch talked, looking at the building. Finch had his lumberyard ledger with him. He opened it at a page he'd marked with a strip of cloth and showed it to Alara without preamble. "I ran the coal figures," he said. "Blackthorne's household. I got them from Agnes. She handles the supplier accounts, passes through the post. She didn't know why I wanted them." He showed her the page. 4 tons delivered 10th of October. Current estimate based on burn rate. Exhausted by 20th of January. Alara looked at the page. "My house," Finch continued, "is 1,200 square feet interior. Blackthorne's is roughly 2,200. Your building here is 340, she said. "Right. But the coal equivalent for maintaining 40 degrees through a 2.5-day storm at those exterior temperatures." He turned a page. He'd done the calculation using figures from his own house as a baseline. "My estimate is that your wall's thermal performance reduced the heat requirement by somewhere between 60 and 70% compared to a single-skin timber structure of equivalent interior volume. Based on what you held inside with 1 small fire versus what Blackthorne's used with 4. She looked at the numbers. She didn't correct them. They were close enough. Ewan Alcott spoke for the first time. He was still looking at the building. "What does it cost?" he said. "To build it." "Material or time?" Alara said. "Both." "Material is mostly what's already on the ground. This parcel had enough stone. Mortar, 2 bags at 4 pence each, timber for the roof frame, Finch helped with that. Helped at cost, Finch said, which meant below cost, which meant nearly nothing. Time, she said, is 6 weeks of full days, longer if you're learning as you go. Ewan Alcott was quiet for a moment. My father's house, he said. He lost it to the lease, but I've got the parcel, the west parcel. It's got stone on it. What kind? She said. Granite. Same as here, I think. She looked at him. He was not asking her to build it for him. He was asking her whether it was possible, which was a different question and one she could answer. The west parcel has a different wind exposure, she said. Southwest facing. You'd need to read it differently. Can you show me? It was not quite a question. She looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Finch. I can show you how to read it, she said. What you do with that is yours. 3 weeks after the storm, Agnes Holt's mother became the number that ended the argument nobody had officially been having. Marta Holt was 71 and had lived in the same cottage on the north edge of Dunrath village for 43 years. The cottage was stone, which was why Agnes had assumed her mother would be fine through winter. But it was old stone, laid by someone long dead who had understood construction the way most people in the valley understood it. Well enough for ordinary winters, not well enough for this one. The gap between well enough and right had revealed itself in the storm's second night, when the north-facing wall of the cottage had begun weeping condensation on its interior surface, warm interior air hitting the stone face that the storm had chilled to below freezing, moisture dropping out of the air at the contact point. By morning, the interior of Marta's north wall had a thin rime of ice on it. The room temperature had dropped to below 30 degrees despite the fire. Marta had spent 3 days in that room. Agnes had found her on the 4th morning, the day after the storm broke, confused and unable to stand without assistance. The doctor from the village, a man named Purdy, who had come to Dunrath 6 years earlier, and stayed because no one else had come to replace him, had diagnosed a chest condition brought on by prolonged cold exposure. He had said this carefully because Marta Holt was 71 and 3 days in a room at 28 degrees was not something a 71-year-old body processed without consequence. He was more direct with Agnes than with the patient. Her lungs, he said. It depends on the next week. Agnes had said nothing for a moment. Then, her wall was sweating. Inside. Yes, condensation on a cold surface, the wall temperature dropped below. What prevents that? Purdy looked at her. Mass, primarily. A wall with enough mass doesn't drop below condensation point in short-term cold events. The thermal lag, the time it takes for the cold to penetrate through to the interior surface, can be long enough that the exterior temperature event is over before the interior face is affected. Agnes thought about the stone building on the north slope above town. She thought about the walls, which she had not seen up close, but which Finch had described to her in the post office 2 weeks ago, with an emphasis she had found puzzling at the time. 22 inches, she remembered him saying, at the base. Her mother's cottage wall was 11. She went up to the north slope herself that afternoon, while Marta was sleeping under 3 blankets and the doctor was 3 doors down from the cottage waiting. She walked up the slope without telling anyone where she was going, which was not typical behavior for her, but then most things in the past week had not been typical. She reached the boundary marker and called out. Alara came to the doorway. Agnes stood in the snow and looked at her. She was not a woman who had difficulty speaking. Her work required more words per day than almost any other occupation in Dunrath, and she had no anxiety about deploying them. But she stood there for a moment before she said anything. My mother, she said. I heard, Alara said. Dunrath was a small community. News moved. Her wall. The condensation. Yes. Agnes looked at the north face of the stone building, then back at Alara. You built to prevent that. Wall mass above a certain threshold means the interior surface temperature stays above dew point through a short, cold event, depending on wall thickness and storm duration. What threshold? 18 to 20 inches of dense stone is generally sufficient for a 2 to 3 day event at these temperatures, with good mortar pointing. Agnes was quiet. She looked at the wall. Her cottage wall is 11 inches, she said. I know. You know her cottage. I've passed it, Alara said. I looked. Agnes turned this over for a moment. When? October. I walked the village in October. You were... Agnes stopped. She looked at Alara. She recalculated something about the woman in front of her, silently, and the recalculation took a visible moment. You were surveying. Reading, Alara said. There's a difference. Agnes stood in the snow. Behind her, the valley spread out below, the village visible, her mother's cottage not visible from here, but present in her mind with its 11-inch walls and its cold interior, and the doctor sitting 3 doors away, waiting to see which way the week went. "What would it take?" Agnes said. "To repoint her wall, inside I mean. Inside the north face. Would that—" "Internal insulation would help more than pointing," Alara said, "if you can't rebuild." "We can't rebuild, she won't leave it. Then pack the interior north wall. 3 inches of compressed turf behind timber lathing. It won't fix the mass problem, but it will slow the infiltration rate enough to matter." Agnes looked at her. "Can you—" "Show you what to do?" "Yes." She paused. "Not do it for you." "I wasn't going to ask that." "I know." Alara went down to Marta Holt's cottage 4 days after Agnes came to the slope. Marta was still in bed. Purdy had been twice more. The chest condition was improving, which meant the week had gone the better of the 2 ways it might have gone. But Purdy had told Agnes with the particular directness he reserved for important information that Marta could not spend another winter in that room in its current state. Agnes had already procured the timber lathing and the turf. She had done it quietly, through Finch's yard, without mentioning to anyone what it was for or on whose guidance she was acting. Alara walked the interior of the north room first. She ran her hand along the wall face, cold to the touch in a way that told her the interior temperature of the stone was close to the surface temperature, which confirmed that the mass was insufficient at this dimension to provide thermal lag against short-term events. She looked at the mortar, pointing. It was old, still basically intact, but with hairline cracking at the joins that would allow air infiltration in sustained wind events. She pointed at the wall. "The pointing first," she said to Agnes, who was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. "Then the lathing and turf. Pointing alone won't be enough, but if you do the turf without the pointing, the air infiltration behind the lathing creates a convection path and you've made it worse." Agnes nodded. From the bed in the corner, Marta Holt, who had said nothing since Alara's arrival, said, "You're the widow." "Yes," Alara said. "Up on the north slope." "Yes." A pause. "They said you'd gone mad," Marta said. Alara looked at the wall she was going to work on. "A lot of people say a lot of things," she said. "Yes." Another pause. "My wall was sweating." "It was." "And yours wasn't." "Mine wasn't." Marta Holt was quiet for a moment. Outside, the winter light came through the south-facing window and lay across the bed in a pale rectangle. "Fix the wall," the old woman said. Not to Alara specifically, not to Agnes, to the situation, which had finally become clear enough to address. Ewan Alcott broke his first ground on the west parcel in the 3rd week of January. He did it alone, in weather that was still hard, because the ground was still frozen and the frost would not fully release until March, and he had decided not to wait. He had a crowbar, a length of rope, and a piece of charcoal in his coat pocket that he used to mark stones he wanted. He had spent 3 hours on the west parcel with Alara the previous week. She had walked it in the particular way she walked land, stopping at irregular intervals, facing different directions, not speaking. He had followed her without asking questions, because he'd understood from the first 5 minutes that the questions would be answered by watching, not by prompting. At one point she'd stopped and poured water from a canteen at a specific location and stood watching where it went. At another point she'd put her palm flat on the ground and held it there. He had done neither of these things. He had watched her do them, and he had looked at where she was looking, and he had tried to understand what information the landscape was offering, and he had caught perhaps 40% of it, which was 40% more than he'd had before. She had pointed at a spot, not the obvious spot, the level ground in the parcel's center. A spot 12 feet north and slightly east of it, closer to the boundary wall. "There," she said. "Because of the—" He looked at the land's angle, at the boundary wall, which was old dry stone, loose laid, low, at the way the parcel opened to the southwest. Because of the wind from the southwest hitting the boundary wall and deflecting up before it reaches. Yes, he had stood at the spot she'd indicated and tried to feel what she was describing. The boundary wall was 4 feet high at this point. The wind deflecting off a 4-foot obstacle would rise at an angle. He estimated the deflection zone's dead area would extend perhaps 10 to 12 feet behind the wall before the wind reconverged at height. "The quiet place," he said, remembering what she'd said to Finch. She had looked at him. It was the first time she'd looked directly at him since the walk began. "Yes," she said. Now, alone on the west parcel in January, he drove the crowbar into the frozen ground at the spot she'd indicated and felt the impact travel up his arms and into his shoulders. The ground was hard. He drove the bar in again. And again. He did not come down from the parcel until dark. He did not tell anyone what he was doing, or why, or whose guidance had put him at that particular spot, rather than the obvious one 12 feet south. He just drove the crowbar into the frozen ground and worked. By the following October, there were 4 crowbars working ground that had never been broken before. You could see them from the road if you knew where to look. 4 separate figures on 4 separate parcels, scattered across the hillsides north and west of Dunrath, each one driving iron into frozen soil in the particular methodical rhythm that the work required. None of them were working the obvious ground. 3 of the 4 were building on spots that would have looked wrong to anyone who hadn't learned to read the land first. Too close to a boundary wall, too near a rock face, too far from the level centre of the parcel, where common sense said a building ought to go. Ewan Alcott had finished his west parcel building in August. He'd taken 7 months rather than 6 because he'd had to stop twice to bring in the spring planting, and because he'd torn down and rebuilt his northeast corner after deciding the bearing wasn't right. The rebuilt corner was 2 inches thicker at the base and keyed differently. He hadn't asked anyone whether this was correct. He'd looked at it for 3 days, running his hand along the courses, pressing at the mortar joins, and then he'd decided it was right and proceeded. His building held 36 degrees through its first winter test, a 3-day freeze in late November that sent the valley temperature to 8 degrees and iced the inside of every single skin timber structure in Dunrath, including 3 that had been considered well built. Ewan's walls showed nothing. He told one person about the spot selection method. Then that person told one other. Then that other person came to Ewan with questions Ewan couldn't fully answer, and Ewan sent him up the North Slope. The North Slope had become a place people went with questions. Not always with announcement, not always with stated purpose. A farmer would appear at the boundary marker on a Tuesday morning and stand there until Alara came out. And then there would be a conversation that lasted between 10 minutes and 2 hours, depending on what the farmer needed to understand. Some came once. Some came back 4 or 5 times over a season, each time with a more specific question than the last, which meant they'd been working and thinking between visits. She never charged for this. She did not consider it a service. It was closer to what her grandmother had done in Argyllshire, a transfer of information between people who needed it, without ceremony, because the information was not hers to withhold. In 1889, the second winter after the storm, there were 7 double-skin stone structures on the hillsides and valley edges of Dunrath that had not existed in 1887. In 1891, there were 11. By 1894, there were 19, ranging from full houses to storage buildings to a particularly well-built lambing shelter on the Macready farm that old Fergus had constructed himself at 63 years old, following principles he'd had explained to him twice by Ewan Alcott and once by Alara directly. Fergus's lambing shelter had walls 20 inches thick and a roof pitched at 26 degrees, 2 degrees shallower than Alara's building, because the Macready parcel's exposure was slightly different and the snow shed requirement was correspondingly different. He had worked this out himself, using the logic rather than copying the number. Alara had not told him the pitch. He'd arrived at it by understanding why the pitch mattered, which was a different thing and a better one. She had noticed this when she'd seen the building for the first time. She had said nothing about it to anyone. The name appeared in the community the way names appear, not through declaration but through repetition, each person saying it slightly differently until the variations smoothed into one. People began calling it widow walling. Not immediately, not as a formal term. It started as a descriptive shorthand, the way Alcott builds, someone might say, or that double skin method the Dun widow showed, and over 2 or 3 years of compression and repetition, it became a noun. Widow walling. The double skin stone technique with packed rubble core, battered outer face, and site selection based on wind shadow reading, rather than convenience or aesthetics. The name carried the whole story in 2 words, which was efficient. It also meant that by the time a 3rd generation of builders in Dunrath were using the technique, they were using a name that gestured at an origin without requiring them to know the details of it. A young man might tell his son, build it widow wall style the way it's done up here, and the son would know what was meant without knowing that the widow in question had driven her own crowbar into frozen ground in October of 1887 alone, 2 weeks after being left on a hillside that nobody wanted. The knowledge travelled in the technique. The name was a placeholder for a history that most people knew only partially, and some didn't know at all. Callum Blackthorne rebuilt the north wing of the family mansion in 1893. He didn't announce what he was doing differently or why. He commissioned a mason from Inverness, a professional, trained, with references, and he specified the wall dimensions himself. 20 inches, he told the mason. Double skin, rubble core, 2-degree batter on the north and west faces. The mason had looked at the specification and said he'd done similar work on coastal buildings, but not typically this far inland. Callum said, "Do it as specified." The mason did. Edmund Blackthorne, who was 67 by then, and had developed the habit of sitting in a specific chair in the east sitting room on cold mornings because that room held its heat better than the others, walked through the rebuilt north wing in December of 1893, and stood in the corridor for a long time. The corridor was the same temperature as the sitting room. He stood there and felt this. He put his hand on the north wall, the rebuilt wall, and felt the stone. Cold on the outer face, he knew, because it was 10 degrees outside and the wind was coming from the northwest. Warm on the interior face, under his palm. Mass, Callum had told him, when Edmund asked about the specification. The wall mass delays the temperature penetration. Cold outside for 3 days doesn't mean cold inside for 3 days. It means cold inside for a week after, maybe 2, depending on the mass. But by then, the cold snap is over, and the mass is working the other way, slowly releasing stored heat rather than slowly transmitting cold. Edmund had listened to this. He had not asked where Callum had gotten the specification. Callum had not offered to explain it. This was a conversation they did not have, and its shape, the specific contours of what was said and what wasn't, told both of them everything that needed to be communicated. The north wing corridor held 44 degrees through the worst February Dunrath had seen in a decade. Edmund sat in his chair in the east sitting room and was warm, and he said nothing to anyone about this, and the saying nothing was its own kind of acknowledgement. In the spring of 1896, a man named Douglas Price came to Dunrath from 60 miles southeast, in the border country, where he managed a trust that had been established to provide housing improvements for tenant farming families across 3 counties. He had heard about widow walling through a county agricultural officer who had visited Dunrath the previous autumn and had been struck by the thermal performance data that Finch, still keeping his ledger, had compiled over 8 winters. Finch's data covered 19 double-skin stone buildings across the Dunrath area, with interior temperature records maintained by the occupants against exterior temperature logs that the County Agricultural Office had been collecting since 1885. The comparison was specific and unambiguous. Double-skin stone construction with rubble core maintained interior temperatures an average of 23 degrees above exterior in sustained cold events, against an average of 11 degrees for comparable single-skin timber or thin stone construction. 11 degrees was the difference between a room that was uncomfortable and a room that was dangerous. Price had read the figures and made a trip. He came to Finch first because Finch's name was on the data. Finch showed him the ledger over 2 hours in the lumberyard office, answering questions about methodology and sample size and the specific construction parameters of each building in the dataset. Then he brought Price up the north slope. Alara was 41 years old by then. The building she had constructed in 1887 was 9 years old. The walls had not moved. The roof had been rethatched once in 1892 because thatch has a finite lifespan regardless of construction quality. The walls were the same walls, the same mortar, the same courses she had laid in October and November of that first year. The exterior face had weathered to a darker grey than when it was new, and the mortar lines had the slight rounding of aged lime that meant they had cured fully and settled and were no longer actively changing. Price stood outside the building and looked at it for a long time. He was an educated man. He'd studied at Edinburgh. He had letters after his name. He had access to construction literature that described thermal mass principles in technical language derived from physics and engineering. He understood the theory. He had read papers about it. He had not seen it built by one woman alone on a hillside that nobody wanted in 6 weeks using a crowbar and 4 pence worth of mortar. He went inside. He walked the interior as Callum Blackthorne had done 8 years earlier. He looked at the hearth design. He looked at the window placement, south-facing, for winter light, protected from direct wind exposure. He looked at the roof angle. "The pitch," he said to Finch, who had followed him in. 28 degrees. Yes? Snow sheds at 22. She set it above the minimum. Because, Price worked through it, because this close to the ridge, a borderline pitch might hold wet snow rather than shedding it, and the load differential. Yes, Finch said. Price was quiet for a moment. She calculated this. She read it. There's a difference, apparently. Price looked at the wall. He pressed his hand against it, same as everyone pressed their hand against it, because that was what you did when you needed to understand something with your body rather than your mind. He asked to speak with Alara directly. They sat outside on 2 stones near the east wall in the spring afternoon. Price had a notebook. He opened it and held his pencil and looked at her. "The Trust is looking at construction specifications for tenant housing improvements," he said. 43 properties across 3 counties. Most of them have the same problem. Single-skin walls under 14 inches, north-facing exposure, high infiltration rates. We've had 2 deaths attributed to cold exposure in the last 4 winters, both elderly. She listened. "I want to understand the site selection method," he said. "The principles, not just the wall construction, that I can get from the ledger, but how you chose the location." She looked at the parcel around them, at the granite outcropping, at the 3 trees, still leaning at their angle, older now and more pronounced in their lean. "The trees first," she said. "Trees tell you where the wind goes, not where it comes from, where it goes. Those 3 are leaning southeast, which means the prevailing wind force on this parcel comes from the northwest, which you could find on a compass. But the angle of the lean tells you the wind's behavior at ground level specifically, which a compass won't tell you. That's the wind after it's interacted with the ridge above. Different from the wind in open country." Price wrote this down. "Then the water," she said. "You pour water at different points and watch where it goes. Not for drainage, for the subsurface picture. Water finds inconsistencies in the ground that you can't see from the surface. Frost pockets, subsurface channels. A spot that looks level and dry might collect cold air overnight and be 3 degrees colder than the surrounding ground by morning. 3 degrees matters in January." He wrote. "Then you stand in different places and wait," she said. He looked up from the notebook. "You wait until you can feel where the air is still," she said. "Not calm, still. There's a difference. The quiet place. Every piece of ground has one, relative to its specific wind exposure. It moves slightly based on wind direction and speed, but the center of it is consistent. That's where you build." Price looked at his notes. He looked at the building behind her and the granite outcropping and the relationship between them. "Your grandmother taught you this," he said. "Yes." "Where did she learn it?" Alara looked at the hillside. The spring grass was coming through the old dead growth in patches, small and green against the grey. The sound of the wind was present but moderate, nothing like winter, just the ordinary breath of the slope in March. "She didn't know," she said. "She said it came from before anyone thought to write things down." Price sat with this for a moment, then he wrote something in his notebook. He looked at what he'd written. He closed the notebook. "I'd like to include your name in the trust documentation," he said, "for attribution." "What would that do?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Probably nothing practical. It would put your name next to the method." She looked at the building, at the wall that had stood 9 winters, at the mortar lines that had cured and settled and gone nowhere. "Put the method in," she said. "Leave my name out." The method went into the trust documentation in 1897. Price called it thermal mass sighting protocol in the official text, which was accurate and complete and bore no resemblance to what people in Dunrath called it. The documentation spread through the Trust's network across 3 counties. By 1901, 41 of the 43 targeted tenant properties had been rebuilt or significantly modified using the principles. Cold-related health incidents in those properties dropped from an average of 7 per winter across the dataset to 1 in the first year and 0 in the second. 0. Finch put that number in his ledger and underlined it once. He was not a dramatic man. The building on the north slope above Dunrath stands today. Not as a ruin, as a building. The walls are original, except for repointing work done in 1923 and again in 1961, both times using lime mortar mixed to the same specification as the original. The thatch was replaced 3 times in the 20th century, most recently in 1987, when a woman named Catherine Vass, who had bought the parcel from the Blackthorn Estate's final dispersal sale, had the roof done by a thatcher who drove up from Inverness and spent 2 days on the job and charged considerably more than 4 pence. Catherine Vass was an architect. She had studied at Glasgow. She knew thermal mass principles from textbooks that explained the physics in terms of specific heat capacity and thermal conductivity and U values. She had designed buildings using these principles. She had not known, when she bought the parcel, that she was buying a building that had preceded her education by 80 years. She found out about the history from Agnes Holt's granddaughter, who was 70 and had lived in Dunrath her entire life and knew the story the way people know old stories, not from documents, from repetition, from the particular way the story had been told and retold until its shape was worn smooth. Catherine Vass sat inside the building on a December afternoon and felt the temperature, which was 39 degrees without a fire, while it was 12 degrees outside. She had her instruments with her. She measured the wall thickness at 3 points. She estimated the mortar composition from visual inspection and the ring of it under her knuckle. She looked at the roof pitch and the hearth design and the window placement and the position of the building relative to the granite outcropping. She wrote in her site notes, "Construction demonstrates complete practical mastery of passive thermal principles. Site selection optimal, no modifications recommended." Then she sat there in the winter light for a while, not writing anything. Elara Dunn lived on the North Slope for 41 years. She did not become wealthy. She did not become famous in any way that travelled beyond the county. She built 4 more structures over the decades: a storage building, a small barn, a second room added to the original building when she needed the space, and a wall that still stands on the McCready Farm's east boundary, which Fergus McCready's grandson points out to visitors occasionally as an example of a wall that has never required repair. She did not marry again. She did not explain this to anyone who asked, and fewer people asked as the years went on. In the winter of 1921, when she was 57, she had a visitor she hadn't expected. Gavin Blackthorn, Edmund's grandson, 23 years old and recently returned from a war that had taken 2 of his cousins and given him back in a condition that his family described as changed, which was the word they used for things they didn't have better words for. He had come back to Dunrath and found the mansion in a state of accumulated disrepair, not structural failure, not yet, but the particular entropy of a large timber building maintained by people who no longer had the means to maintain it properly. Peeling paint, soft wood at the window surrounds, a chimney that drew badly because the flashing had lifted and never been properly reseated. He came up the slope on a Tuesday morning and stood at the boundary marker and called out. She came to the door. He looked older than 23. She looked younger than 57. She was not sure which of these things was more surprising to him. "My grandfather thought you'd freeze," he said. "I know." He looked at the building. He looked at it the way people looked at it when they were seeing it for the first time and understanding what they were looking at, slowly, starting with the walls and moving to the corners and then the roof and then the relationship between the building and the granite and finally back to the walls. "I want to learn," he said, "what you did here, the method." She looked at him for a moment. He was 23, and he had a large, cold house that was slowly failing, and he had come up a slope in winter to stand at a boundary marker and ask directly, without condition or preface. She had been 57 years old for 3 months and had been asked this question in various forms by perhaps 40 different people over the previous 30 years. She stepped back from the doorway. "Come in," she said. "I'll show you where to start." What the Valley of Dunrath learned, over 40 years and 19 buildings and 1 trust document and 1 architect's site notes, was the same thing the hillside had always known. Strength that lasts is not built from the biggest fire or the thickest wallet or the loudest certainty. It is built from 22 inches of stone, placed with care in the quiet place where the wind goes around.